So many of you know our current mayor, Sam Weaver. Sam is both, thank you. Before he was the mayor, he was an engineer, serial entrepreneur, over 30 patents, works on a variety of areas, most recently in converting waste heat to electricity. And a very quick story is spring of 2011, I'm sitting at my desk doing, grinding away, and I get a call from Leslie. This is Sam Weaver. I'm like, oh, because I have some sense of how smart Sam is. Leslie, you've been saying we can move to clean energy more quickly and save money. Leslie, I want to test it. And my stomach went, because I'm being called out. I'm pretty sure we have the data, but it's one thing to be pretty sure you have the data, and it's another thing to keep Sam Weaver happy. So we worked together. He worked with Tom Asprey, who couldn't be here today. He's out of the country. And a big team of people, several of you who are here. Sam and Tom did that modeling back in 2011, said, yeah, we could get to 60% renewable electricity and do it at a price that's lower than Excel. That's before the dramatic drop in clean energy prices. And so the story is more complex than that, but that was one of the reasons that Sam ran for city council in 2013. He was elected, he's continued to serve, he's continued to build coalitions to find solutions that can move our community forward, even when we have disagreements about this, that, and the other thing. So I'd ask you to join me in welcoming our mayor, Sam Weaver.
Thank you so much for coming out. It was great to see this many people turn out for what has come up pretty quickly as a mayor's conversation on clean energy. I want to start by thanking people. The first people I want to thank are Leslie Glustrom and the volunteers who pulled all this together. So I talked to Leslie, maybe a month ago, and said, it's a new year, we don't know what's going to happen in 2020 and 2021. Around the municipal electric utility, maybe we should pull a few people together and have a conversation about where things are going, climate and energy in Boulder. And so here you are. And so Leslie has the vision to say, this needs to be a full community conversation. We need to bring in everyone, regardless of where they sit and where they start and what they know and what they might not know about clean energy, about the climate, and about the climate crisis that we're facing. I want to recognize some elected officials who are here. We hope to have Casey Becker, Speaker of the House, Steve Fenberg, Senate Majority Leader, and Edie Hooton. I have all three of them committed. Steve Fenberg's on his way, so we know he'll be here. Elise Jones is going to talk to us today about fracking. She's a county commissioner, knows a lot about that, and is going to help us. And we expect Mary Young and Junie Joseph, who are my fellow city council members, to talk to us about just transition issues and how equity needs to play a role in our conversation around climate and energy. Also, I want to recognize some other elected officials who are here. Leslie mentioned some of them. We have Matt Jones, who's a current county commissioner and former state senator. We have Suzanne Jones, former mayor of Boulder. I served with her for many years, and it was great to do so, and she's been a champion for these issues for her whole career and her time on city council. Crystal Gray served on city council and the Boulder Planning Board. She has also been fundamental in moving us forward in our conversations about our municipal electric utility and conversations with Excel about what they can do for us. And then Steve Pomerantz, who is another former city council person who's here. Steve has done work with everybody from the PUC to the Boulder City Council on thinking about our energy future and where we need to go. And if I've missed anyone else,
Tim Shackley. Tim.
Hi, Tim. So then our agenda today, after I talk, I'm going to give a short introduction to some of the things that I see coming with climate and energy. And then we'll talk about legislation that's coming at the State House. As you know, there was a lot of legislation passed last year. A lot of that's in an implementation phase this year, and we'll hear from some of our state legislators. And then we want to talk about a just transition and the equity issues around the changes that we need to make to move to a clean climate. And so Junie Joseph and Mary Young will be talking about that, and I'll show you a little bit about how that's core in everything that we're doing. Then we'll talk about resilience and microgrids. So, you know, there's two components to this fight to have a healthy climate. One is mitigation of the pollutants that are causing this problem, and the other is adaptation. So we're locked into some changes, and we need to be able to make sure that our people stay healthy as much as they can during these changes. I'll talk about community power and energy democracy, some of the issues that we need to be focused on as far as how everyone in Colorado can have a say in the energy future that's coming to us. As I said, Elise will talk about fracking, and then we're going to have a half-hour of breakout sessions where we break up into smaller groups, and everyone can talk about how they think that we take the overview that we talked about and turn it into action. So here we are. This is where we sit. This is our beautiful planet. This is one of the highest resolution images of our Earth ever produced. And this is where we have to live. We're not going to Mars. I'm sorry. August, you know, he's a smart guy, but Mars is a really inhospitable place. So this is the planet we have. We have to live in this planet. And the planet has been through much hotter and much colder periods. Hot enough that we couldn't survive, cold enough that we couldn't survive. And so we need to keep the balance on this planet so that the human race can continue to prosper. But we're not doing a very good job with this. So you've all seen these charts. I don't really need to go over this in any detail, but this is the fastest change in the climate that the world has ever seen. Even it equals an asteroid strike or a massive volcanic eruption. That's how disruptive what we're doing to the planet is. And many people talk about this as being the 6th great extinction of all the mass extinctions that are going on. And so it is no laughing matter, it is deadly serious, and it affects every living thing on the planet, not just human beings. The question is, what do we do? What do we do to stop the bleeding? What do we do to mitigate the changes? And what are the most effective things that we can do? We have to do triage. We can't do everything. There are many, many, many things that can be done, and lots of people have opinions about what the most effective things that can be done are and aren't. Luckily for us, there's this project called Project Drawdown. If you've not been to this website, I recommend that you go. This is hundreds of climate scientists who have evaluated hundreds of potential solutions that include ways to reduce carbon emissions reduction and ways to reduce global forcings that are causing the warming on our planet. So these scientists have spent years coming up with a rank ordering of what the most important solutions are. And I'm going to show you the top 15 here, because I think it's important to really recognize that some of these were shocking to me when I first saw them. Look at what's number 1 on this list. It's mitigation of refrigerant leaks, because refrigerants have a very high global warming potential. So I've been talking to Joe Neguse for about a year, trying to get him to bring a bill forward about refrigerants. One of the reasons that refrigerants are so high is not only the high global warming potential, but the fact that you can control just a handful of chemicals. You can find replacements for those chemicals that allow air conditioning and refrigeration, but that do not force global warming nearly as hard as what we've got. We have history of this with the ozone hole. We replaced a bunch of CFC chemicals with other chemicals, and we effectively reduced the growth in the ozone hole. We need a Montreal Protocol for global warming, and refrigerants are at the top. Look at what's number 3, reducing food waste. Who would have thought that food waste is one of the biggest solutions we can make to the climate challenge? We're doing some things, solar farms, that's good. Rooftop solar, number 10, that's good. But there are things that we're not doing, and I'm going to come back to some of those later. And one thing that people have said to me is focus on what's under local control. Well, we have lots of ways to exert local control. One of them is lobbying our state and federal legislators. So looking at where refrigerants sits on this list, please tell Joe, whenever his staffers see me, they're like, you're the refrigerant guy. And I'm like, that's right. So help me be a refrigerant guy, or girl, or woman, do this. So how's Boulder doing? We're working hard. You know, so this is, over the last decade, our total community emissions. So we've taken great efforts to be able to measure what are our emissions from the electricity sector, the transportation sector, the building sector, the industrial sector. And so it's not perfect, but we're looking for the trends, and the trends are in the right direction. However, look down at the bottom. Our goal for 80% emissions reduction is that yellow line. We have a long way to go. We're on track to get there, but we cannot let up. We have to keep our foot on the accelerator to get where we're going. Local renewables. We have a goal of 100 megawatts of local generation in our city footprint, and we're doing well. We're at 60 megawatts of local generation, well on our way to our 2030 goal. And if we get close, we'll move the goalposts, right? Because you're never going to get there in our generation or the next generation to where we fully need to be. But these are goals that help our community focus, and we're measuring our progress to make sure that we report out to the community on how we're doing. But we're missing some things. We are not doing enough on food waste. Suzanne Jones's EcoCycle organization is helping a lot. We're doing composting more than we ever have. The city now has commercial composting requirements as well as curbside composting. But food waste starts by not putting things on your plate that you don't need, or eating everything that you do put on your plate. That's one of the actions that you can do individually. There are some you can't do refrigerant management, but you can manage food waste. Plant-rich diet, how do we educate people? It doesn't mean don't eat any meat. It means if you're going to eat meat, choose the meat you're going to eat so that it's as low as it can be on global warming potential, and eat less. Eat more plants, less meat. Silvopasture. Anyone in here know what that means? I didn't. Okay, good. We've got 3 people. Silvopasture means grazing cattle where there are trees as well as grass, because the trees help sequester the carbon and break up the grazing pattern of the cattle. There's a lot to that, but that's something. We have 45,000 acres of open space, about half of which is ag land, which we have something to say about how it's managed, and regenerative agriculture. We're just starting to look at regenerative ag. And so some of those things are about people. So I just gave you a bunch of numbers, right? I gave you the threat, and I gave you what we're doing. But none of those convey the people part of global warming and climate change. The people is where we have to connect. Everyone in this room is doing that now, and I greatly appreciate it. We have to keep doing that. Our youth are telling us they want change. These people, I've got hundreds of pictures like this to choose from. Youth around the world saying, we have one home. We need to save our home. And it is not about saving the planet. The planet's going to be fine. It's about saving people. So we have to do this with compassion, and we have to do it where we acknowledge that this change is going to be very hard for some people to make, whether it's financial, whether it has to do with their position in society, whether it has to do with their job. There are people who, even if they believe this is true, it's going to negatively impact them personally, and we have to help make sure to mitigate those problems for people. Because if we don't, all the theory in the world, all the numbers about carbon dioxide concentration, and all that we do about it won't matter, because the people won't come along if we don't treat them with compassion. So the city has been thinking deeply about this. How do we move from a metrics-based approach to what we're doing to mitigate, and how do we look at adaptation? So this is the new kind of schematic diagram for how the city is thinking about the Climate Mobilization Action Plan. So for years we've been operating under the Climate Commitment rubric, and this is a bit of a change. The Climate Mobilization Action Plan has equity and resilience at the center. So it's people-based. It is treating people fairly, it is bringing them along, and it is protecting them from the floods and the fires and the other disasters that are going to result from climate change, from what we've already locked in and from what we can't mitigate. And then that goes out, and with those things at the center, we look at renewable energy systems and energy efficiency. So how do we make sure that we're doing everything we can to get fossil fuels out of our system completely? Regenerative ecosystems, that is huge, and it is something we're just embarking on. It's how do we use our lands, growing and grazing, to better sequester carbon in the soils. When we talk about carbon capture, we're not talking about air capture, we're not talking about a fancy technology, we're talking about using agriculture and grazing practices to do our part to pull carbon into the soils. And then a circular materials economy, embedded energy is a thing, and embedded energy means embedded emissions. And so if we can adaptively reuse buildings, if we can have a circular economy where the things that end up going to EcoCycle come back to us as products, so that anything that we use and consume and recycle comes back to us as a useful product, rather than going to a landfill or even going through the energy-intensive recycling process. So this is the new rubric, and you'll hear more about this as we go forward. But this is the way we're centering people at the heart of the work that we're doing to mitigate climate change. So with that, I see that we have our state representatives here. Casey Becker, Steve Fenberg, and Edie Hooton are here. Thank you all for being here. So we'd love to have you guys talk for 10 minutes each about what you're doing, what you see coming at the legislature. And Casey, if you'd like to kick us off, that'd be great.
Hi everyone, I'm Casey Becker. Hi Susan Osborne. I am the Speaker of the House, and I also represent House District 13, which you are currently in. And I live like half a mile over there. And my district, House District 13, goes from Broadway all the way up to Steamboat Springs, but not including Steamboat. And then from the Wyoming border to south of I-70. So it's an enormous district from the Front Range to the Western Slope, and includes most of Rocky Mountain National Park as well. So this is my last year in the legislature, in the House. And we've been moving a very aggressive agenda forward on energy and environment, and on a lot of things. But you guys here are interested in the environmental efforts we've made. And I guess would it be helpful, Sam, to do a little bit about what happened last year, or do you want me to just...
Yeah, just a little background. Last year is great, and then on to what's coming this year. Okay.
So last year was the first year in 4 years that we had had a Democratic trifecta. House, Senate, and the governor are all democratically led, and so we had the ability.
A national model.
So we had a pretty robust agenda, and frankly, I think the entire session is probably the most accomplished, aggressive legislative session I think we've had in modern history, even with other Democratic trifectas. It was huge in terms of the legislation we passed, the breadth and depth of it. But in the environment space, that really was a big focus for us. Obviously, we all worked on and supported Senate Bill 181, which changed the way we regulate oil and gas in Colorado. Yay. The work there isn't done because a lot of what we put in that bill requires the COGCC and the AQCC, so Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, and then AQCC, the Air Quality Control Commission at the state, to do a lot of rulemakings. So what was it, like 10 rulemakings? It was a lot. From addressing orphan wells to changing the mission of the COGCC from prioritizing health and safety, to doing things like methane emissions, rulemaking. I just can't even remember them all right now. We put in a change in the board composition and made them permanent board members instead of volunteers. A lot of these things are still in the process, and so it makes a lot of work for citizens to kind of keep track, but it's really important that folks show up, and I know Logic, the League of Oil and Gas Interested Communities, is very involved. A lot of the environmental groups are showing up at all those rulemakings and really helping make sure everything on Senate Bill 181 is moving in the right direction. It's just hard to put a lot of that in legislation because it'll get nitpicked through the legislative process. It's easier for us to say, make health and safety your #1 priority and then figure that out at the rulemaking process. So 181 was huge. House Bill 1261 that put climate goals in statute for the first time and requires the AQCC to set a path to determine how we're going to get to those goals. So, and it's industry-wide, so it's not just the energy industry or the transportation industry, it's industry-wide. And it's really transformative in terms of how making permit holders across the state try to figure out how they're going to reduce their carbon emissions. So that's currently in rulemaking at the AQCC. Senate Bill 96 also said we have to have a way to measure our carbon emissions, and that's in rulemaking. Okay, AQCC, figure out how we're actually going to measure and monitor and account for the carbon emissions. So we had legislation setting out the goals, we had legislation saying consistently, because if you're not measuring it, right, you can't address it. Maybe I'll leave some of these for Steve to talk about, because he and I worked on a lot of this stuff together. Do you want to talk about 236?
Sure.
You do 236.
Hey everybody. My name is Steve Fenberg. I serve in the state senate, and I have the honor of serving as the Senate Majority Leader. As the speaker said, we have a trifecta. The missing piece of that trifecta was the Senate. So a lot of the big battles on some of this legislation ended up happening in the Senate because the majority is pretty narrow. But one of those bills that the speaker was referring to was Senate Bill 236, which started out as a very boring kind of just run-of-the-mill regulatory bill. And that's because we have something called a sunset process where departments and divisions actually are scheduled to go away unless the legislature says actually it still serves a purpose. It's kind of a good way to clean out our statutes and make sure that what we have on the books are actually accomplishing what we want them to accomplish, and that they're staying in line with modern times. PUC is a pretty good example sometimes of something that isn't always staying in line with sort of the modern world, because it's a big bureaucratic regulator, and obviously we know the energy industry, the utility industry, et cetera, is moving very, very fast right now. So 236 was the bill that was the vehicle for the sunset for the PUC. So the first question we asked ourselves is, do we want the PUC to just go away? The answer quickly was no, even though maybe some people in this room would say, yes, let's do it. But we decided to keep the PUC. And we thought about what are the things we can change to that institution to make it more modern and to sort of respond to the current world when it comes to energy. So there were several things in that bill. It actually ended up encompassing several bills into one. So we called it the Turducken Bill of but it renewed the PUC, but changed many of the aspects of how the PUC does its business. It requires the PUC to incorporate the social cost of carbon when evaluating future resources. It requires distribution system planning, which is very important for ensuring that our distribution system is sort of accommodating more distributed resources like storage and solar, et cetera. And there were probably a million other things in there. That was the bill that actually codified the Excel goals. Is that right? That 1313 or something? So set a lot of really aggressive standards and goals for especially Excel Energy, which was a very willing partner on those goals. And that was an important bill because it sort of sets a framework, and then the PUC will go and do its work over the next 10 years or so before we look at it again with this new framework of how they're going to do their regulations. So it's super important. It impacts more than just the utility industry, actually. My big cross to bear on that bill in some ways was including the PUC being required to regulate towing, or not towing, but booting companies. They already regulate towing companies, and that's why booting companies popped up, because they didn't want to be regulated as a towing company. So it's actually kind of funny to talk about booting, but it's a serious issue because some of those companies really do prey on low-income folks, and it's almost like a hostage situation when you get a boot on your car, because they can just charge you whatever they want. So no longer will they be able to do that. And that's more just a nod to the fact that the PUC is not just about this cool energy stuff, but it's really about all utilities and all of a lot of consumer protection issues that are encompassed in that institution as well. So that's Senate Bill 236. Do you want the mic back, or do you want me to?
I'll just mention
Yep.
another piece of important legislation we passed last year was the Just Transition Bill. And that's, as I was moving the climate bill through the legislature, the union said we're going to oppose this if you can't make some commitment specifically on jobs. And so we decided to do it as separate legislation, and we created the Just Transition Office. Initially, in the first version of the bill, we had sort of all types of funding mechanisms that were, the way they had wanted it drafted was to have the state come up with all sorts of new funding for people losing their jobs. And I think my concern with that is I feel like the utilities should bear a lot of that cost. And the state may have some role, but we were not ready to land on one particular, here's a big fund. But we can create the office. We didn't know like when we need the money, what is going to be the best use of the money, where that money is going to need to be, how much it is. So let's create the office. And then this year we're working on how to fund a just transition. And with Tri-State's big announcement a couple weeks ago about closing all of their coal in Colorado, during last year's session they said, we'll never be able to meet your obligations under 1261. Will you do a carve out for us? And we said, no, we will not do a carve out for you. And this year they said, oh, okay, guess what we're doing? We're closing all of our coal. And they're doing it, and they can do it. So they wanted a carve out. We didn't give it to them. One of the things we were talking about yesterday is really how they're going to meet some of their just transition responsibilities and what is the state's role in helping them with that. And we haven't figured that out. But the Just Transition Office is created, is staffed, and it's really the first in the nation. And I've gotten calls from other state legislators saying, how do you do this? Why do you set it up this way? How can we, what are the lessons learned? So I feel like it's going to be a really good model, a really good benefit for this in the state and a good model for other states. Do you want to talk about
carve out? explain what that
Oh,
means?
they wanted to like get a pass on meeting the 1261 goals, and we said no. Last year, they didn't get the carve out. I think that obviously that's a huge piece of why they are now made the announcement that they did. All of this in the House went through the committee that Edie Hooton is the vice chair of the Energy and Environment Committee. And maybe, do you want to talk about some of the other legislation that ran through your committee? I created that committee, the Energy and Environment Committee in the House, and put people on it who I knew would support everything that I wanted to get done. And it worked, so we'll see what happens next year. But
Okay, sure.
mention it.
Yeah.
Whatever you want.
Well, I'm thinking more about,
This coming year?
yeah.
Okay.
So, hello everyone, thank you. Thank you for gathering on a Saturday morning. It's really nice to see all of you. And thank you to Sam and to Leslie for organizing this event. It's incredible how big energy conversation is at the Capitol. It went from sort of being a niche conversation to now everybody is talking about it. And it's a pretty steep learning curve for the majority of people under the dome. And I've had the great fortune of working with a couple of energy experts here in Boulder, Larry Milosevic and Dan Greenberg, and they're the ones who've been working with me on my community choice energy bill, which I'm sure everyone in this room has heard something about. And there will be a panel later. I can talk to you about that. But just to tell you briefly, this spring I heard a presentation from a woman who's the head of a nonprofit in California and was the originator of the Marin County Community Choice Aggregation Authority. Her name is Shawn Marshall. And knowing, and I've been a big supporter of the municipalization effort since its inception here in Boulder. And, but, you know, it's been a real slog for us, and I don't think we should stop our efforts. But when I saw what there might be as a general solution for other communities in Colorado, I got very interested. And so then started meeting with Dan and Larry, and then that led to a role that two of us had on an interim committee, an investor-owned utility interim committee to look at all kinds of energy legislation. And we were able to get a bill drafted, and I introduced that, and we had some pretty good discussions around that, and that passed out of the committee. And so it was just introduced a couple weeks ago, and we had our first hearing on it on Thursday. We had some excellent testimony, and as you can imagine, there's quite a bit of resistance to even studying the possibility of changing the status quo in Colorado. So I don't think this is going to be something that's going to happen easily. We've got the Senate side, I don't know if it's Casey or Steve mentioned, we only have a 1-vote majority now because people keep having babies and staying at home. Yeah, so anyway, Steve is a new father. I
haven't been staying home much.
No, you haven't. But we have a colleague, our colleague Brittany Pedersen, just last week had a baby, and she's a senator, and so she's going to be out quite a bit. So anyway, so that makes things really challenging on the Senate side. But the hearing went really well. It was quite an education for the members of the committee. We had provided them with quite a bit of information prior to the committee meeting, so there actually were some fairly well-informed questions. But, you know, it's the legislature, it's process, it's very disruptive. And even just like I said, even just the idea of studying something that could potentially impact the vertically integrated investor-owned utility model really chills a lot of people. So even even people you would think would be our natural allies. So these relationships go on for generations. It's been over 100 years, and these relationships are legitimate, they're real, and relationships matter. So there's part of that factor, but we've got, you know, Pueblo is trying to municipalize, and they're really driven by rates. And Boulder wants to municipalize because we're really driven by decarbonizing our electric supply. And John Cook, who's a conservative senator from Weld County, doesn't like monopolies, and he wants to see competition, and that drives down rates, and others say it drives innovation, which of course we know it does. So people have different reasons for supporting a concept like this. So we'll just see how that goes. The bill has been laid over. It doesn't mean that it failed. It just means by the time we got to the amendment phase, we had to end the meeting, so hopefully within the next week or two, we'll be able to introduce our amendments and then get the bill passed. And then on to another committee, which is appropriations. So anyway, lots of hurdles, and you don't eat an elephant in one bite, right? It's one bite at a time. So we've got other bills coming up that I'm sure will interest you. We've got a single-use plastics bill that's coming up. Yeah, oh boy. I get more mail about that and styrofoam than anything else, honestly. So we've got a styrofoam bill coming up. What else is happening? Oh yes, we've got organic burials coming up. That's, if anyone's familiar with that. Yeah, where you can be buried as a whole person in a potato sack. What's that?
Pesticides?
Oh yeah, pesticides. We've got a bee bill that would actually take any product with neonicotinoids in them off the shelves, retail. So, yeah. So that's what I am anticipating coming before the Energy Committee. And yeah, we had, last year we passed a bill that would allow communities to provide more support, particularly around the commercial construction buildings, of greening up buildings. That can be expensive when you're already in your own home. Residentials, I think, are down the road a little bit, but commercial, we know that the greenhouse gases from commercial buildings are pretty significant. I got in a little late, I apologize, Sam, but was that on your list? Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. So we're looking at a lot of energy. That's just the new kid on the block, and you guys were here way before everyone else on that issue, which is, once again, makes me really proud to represent Boulder. So thank you, and I'm sure we'll get to Q&A at some point.
So everyone, thank our state legislators. They're here in the middle of the legislative session, which is hard to do, so say thank you for being here. We'd like to take a moment to have a few questions. If anyone's got a question or two for our state representatives. RJ.
Steve, I don't think you have a calendar on top of your head, but the meeting that will consider Susan Perkins' appointment to the PUC.
I was hoping no one would ask that.
Thanks for the date so I can plan my business around it.
Right.
So, okay, I'll think about how to say this relatively delicately, I guess. What RJ is referring to is Susan Perkins, who several of you probably know, was appointed by the governor as the third PUC commissioner to replace Francis Concelia, whose term ended at the end of the year. Confirmations go through the Senate to get, or appointments go through the Senate to get confirmed, just like at the federal level. And generally speaking, the governor has the right to appoint whoever, and the Senate may discuss or complain about it, but generally speaking, that's the person who gets put into that seat. This one is getting a little complicated because my sense is that the governor wanted to appoint someone with a strong Pueblo connection because Francis Concilia is obviously a big champion for Pueblo. So Susan has done a lot of work with the city down there on their municipalization and other efforts. So she seemed like a pretty natural appointment. It's run into some snags because the Senate president who is from Pueblo, you're probably catching on to a theme here, has some concerns that she may be conflicted out of making a ruling on decisions related to Black Hills and the city of Pueblo. I disagree with him strongly on that interpretation, but he has some questions. And so to answer your question, I guess, is I don't know, because her appointment hasn't technically been introduced in the Senate yet. And once that gets introduced, then it's in my hands to schedule it as the majority leader, but the Senate president actually is in charge of introducing the confirmation. So it could be next week or it could be in April.
Thank you,
She's
Steve.
serving.
No, she's not. She can't
Francis
serve.
is.
Francis Concilia is serving. Susan can't serve until she's appointed or until May when we're in recess, and then the governor can do recess appointments.
So we got time for one more question. Micah?
Thanks. We had Climate Lobby Day yesterday, 350 Colorado did. We got to talk to Casey, which was great. We did miss, I think, both Steve and Edie. A couple of the bills that won't go through the Energy Committee, but are also really important for...
I spoke to Penny Day.
Oh, good. Great. A couple of the bills, though, that are being introduced that won't go through Edie's committee, but probably finance, that are both focused on defunding climate disaster. They're looking at getting PARA to divest from fossil fuels. A report came out this fall showing that PARA lost almost $1.77 billion over the last decade by being invested in fossil fuels. And so we're asking for PARA to divest from fossil fuels for the ethical reasons and the fiduciary reasons. But also, there's another bill that that's important to our city, that is giving our cities options to bank with other institutions like credit unions or to create a public bank, besides having to bank with the big Wall Street banks. Like right now, Boulder's having to, well, we are banking with JP Chase, which is the #1 funder of fossil fuels on the planet. And so, anyway, just wanted to ask if we could count on y'all's support for those bills. Thank you.
So Mike, I think you're right that those are probably House bills. They haven't been introduced yet, so there's no committee or timeline or anything as far as I know. But I'll let the speaker talk to that. But I support both of those concepts. I haven't seen any bill language, but yeah, I'm on board. Great.
And I said the same thing. In concept, I'm supportive. The devil's in the drafting. I haven't seen a bill. I expect it'll come up in the next couple of weeks. And I've encouraged the bill sponsor to actually work with PARA to figure it out, because if she drafts it in a way that is going to, if they have to sell at the wrong time and they lose money, or they really have to manage with the best interest of the fund holders, all the retirees, a lot of teachers and local government employees. So I encouraged her to really sit down with PARA to figure out the right way to draft it. If you draft it the wrong way, the concept can be good, but it'll die if it's not handled correctly. So we'll see. I haven't seen the draft. And what was the other one you mentioned? The banking options. Banking options. Again, I think that there's a lot of support, at least for the credit union aspect of it. Creating a state bank, I think, will get a lot of resistance, and allowing municipalities to create their own banks would get a lot. Well, the credit union one will get resistance. Put them all three together, and the bill is probably dead right off the bat. So I told Jonathan, can you kind of pick the lane that you think you can actually pass? And so I'm not sure what where he's going to end up going. He said he wants to put all three concepts in and sort of whittle it down if he needs as the process goes. Sometimes that's a strategy that works, sometimes it's not. So we'll see. Again, it's you have to figure out the right way to draft a bill so that you can actually keep it moving. So we'll see what happens. I did want to mention there's a whole bunch, I think there are probably 20 different bills that, the biggest stuff was last year, but there's a lot this year. Energy efficiency law, legislation, climate legislation that is more focused on adaptation, legislation more focused on buildings, legislation more focused on the transportation sector. So it's a lot of things that can potentially make a little difference. Some of it to reduce carbon, but a lot of it is more sort of adaptation and mitigation. But I think generally, if you want to track this stuff, you're going to be very busy all session. I think probably over 20 pieces of legislation so far. So whoever's in charge of that here, you should be paying them because it's a lot to keep track of.
So just kind of building off of what Casey was just saying, there's going to be a lot of bills. The really big picture bills, I think, were last year. Now we're getting a little more into the nitty gritty and sort of sector by sector and things like that, so there will be a lot. I was just talking to Sam, and one policy that he wanted me to cover was the electrification bill that will likely be introduced this year. It's a bill I'm working on in the Senate. Basically, it is, everyone's probably familiar with energy efficiency programs, demand-side management that the utilities generally do to give you an incentive to buy a new furnace or, to upgrade your windows or something like that. It would be similar, but it would specifically be for commercial and residential and industrial buildings, so all buildings, to move from natural gas to high-efficiency electricity. So this would be for specific appliances like furnaces, space heating, water heating, cooking, and things like that, to not just address the extraction side of natural gas, but also the demand, which, as we know, obviously plays a key role in how much the operators feel like they need to extract and what they can sell it for and things like that. So we will be working on that bill. Another really big thing is, obviously a lot happened on oil and gas last year, 181 and a few other things. We're going to probably be doing a lot more work on air quality this year, so not just looking at the actual regulation of the industry, but looking more at the regulation and containment of the toxins and emissions that are coming from that industry, as well as others. So we'll be doing a lot of work specifically on air monitoring and mitigation efforts and things like that when it comes to fees and enforcement. So look out for some of those bills soon too. Great.
All right, thank you guys. So we're going to move on. I want to introduce two of my fellow council members, Junie Joseph and Mary Young, and they're going to talk to you today about equity and just transition issues. Junie?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you on this Saturday morning. So I will be giving you just a broad overview of... Can you hear me much better now?
Yeah.
Great. So we're talking about equity. And the city of Boulder is very concerned about the difference between output versus outcome in the renewable energy policy discourse. We are aware of the impact of the transition on socioeconomically challenged people. We understand all the climate change affects all. The impacts are not shared equally. Climate change impact compounds socioeconomic disadvantages based on decades of public disinvestment, government-promoted segregation, inequitable economic development, and gentrification. Our previous policies failed to take into account the lived experience of people of color and low-income communities. People of color are more likely to live in substandard housing that increase their exposure to health risk like poor indoor air quality. The location of communities of color often expose them to increased environmental risk like flooding and pollution. People of color and other vulnerable populations face disproportionate risk of death and other impact of extreme heat. Low-income communities are more likely to experience urban heat islands, which means that where they reside in these urban areas tend to be a little bit hotter than the surrounding communities. So what we are doing in Boulder when it comes to racial equity. In 2006, Boulder established the Inclusiveness and Diversity Team and partnered with CU Office of Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement to start building a community network of partners. In 2016, the City of Boulder refocused efforts around equity with training throughout the organization. In 2018, the city initiated racial equity work throughout the organization. So I wanted to also now move along and talk a little bit more about employment. The City of Boulder recognized that our climate mobilization action plan goals must go beyond just closing the gap. We must establish appropriate benchmark that lifts all population while paying close attention to those often excluded and impacted. Although we are working toward our climate goals, we know it is important to assess the potential barriers and make necessary adjustments. Consequently, we believe that governments must take a people-centered approach to creating decent jobs and protect livelihood as we move toward our carbon-neutral economy. What does that really mean? So it's about creating decent work for all, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. How are we doing this? Part of it, the city is partnering with, again, as I mentioned, CU, with the Just Transition Collaborative in order to learn best practice for climate and employment practices and to produce community-relevant research. Our main objective as we move forward is to assess the employment, social, and economic impact of climate action, implement skill development, and upgrading measures, design innovative social protection policies to promote workers and vulnerable groups, increase the transfer of technology and knowledge in blighted areas, alongside innovation and responsible investment, foster a conducive business environment to enable businesses and small businesses especially to adapt low carbon production processes, and also creating mechanism for inclusive social dialogue to build consensus for transformative and sustainable change. So I wanted to talk to you again. I'll just give you a broad overview. As a new council member, I've only been on the council for about 3 months now, I think, since November. And Mary has been on council for more than 7 years, so she'll be able to give you, for 6 years, she'll be able to give you more the specific contextual policy that we've been working on the city council. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll just hold it up to my mouth like this. So thanks, Junie, for that. And so our plan was to just go over the big, broad picture that Junie would present. And then I would talk about just what does that look like on the ground in Boulder. And so I think one of the big things that I'll lead with is that just transition is not something that you check off the list. It is all of the above, which is principle, process, and practice. It's a way, it's how you do things, not something that you do. The way this came about was when the Climate Action Plan came before council, just after I'd gotten on council, which was, I don't know, maybe 2014, 2015, something like that. Something big jumped out at me about that Climate Action Plan. It had zero mention of the impact on people. Zero. I mean, that was, to me, that was huge. Which led to a conversation with staff and the university, which led to the establishment and funding of the Just Transition Collaborative. That Just Transition Collaborative focused in the university and a partnership with CU Engage and the Flows program up there had provided a report to the city, which then led to what we now have in front of us with the CMAP, the Climate Mobilization Action Plan. The CMAP focuses on resilience and equity. And so really, what are we talking about with a just transition? A just transition recognizes that there will be impacts on people. And the people that will be the most affected, just as with climate change itself, will be the people that are disenfranchised from government. And so the focus should really be on talking to trade unions, to labor unions, and making sure that those folks that are going to be affected will be included in the conversation. So what do policies look like that we could have done better? I'll give you 2 local examples. One of them is focusing on solar panels on roofs. Sounds awesome, doesn't it? But wouldn't it have been more equitable to start with solar gardens? Solar gardens are accessible to everybody and not a function of whether or not you can get sun on your roof, not a function of whether or not you can afford that. So a start with solar gardens would have been a more equitable approach. I'll give you another example, one that I've been fighting for since I got on council, which is a more equitable eco-pass. It's one of the reasons I ran for council, because I noticed that the eco-pass was terribly inequitable. And I will say this much, having served for 1 year on the RTD pass working group, RTD does not like the eco-pass for that reason. It's for that reason, really. That's the reason that they do not like it. And so I'm very excited about the outcome, although it had some negative effects on the current eco-pass. But the outcome of it has been that there was a 70% discount for youth and a 40% low-income base fare. That sounds good too, but few people know about the income-based fare. I've talked to people that are getting to their jobs, their cleaning jobs, by the bus and take 3 buses to get to one place, and they're paying full fare. They don't know about it. So, you know, it's like one thing that you do is you do these great things, well, then how do you get the word out to people? So those are examples of how we could have done things differently in the beginning to make our town more just. But hopefully things will change, and things are changing. Junie talked about the work that the city is doing. The Government Alliance on Racial Equity, which is part of a giant coalition of cities across the country that is looking at the institutionalized and structural things baked into government that are basically discriminatory, which isn't surprising given, I've been listening to a lot of constitutional history lately, yeah, we learned. But our country wasn't established on the principles that we think they were established on. So it's not shocking to see that a lot of our government policies and structures are meant to exclude. One thing that I'm really excited about, that I've also been working on since I got on council, is this year the city's going to hire a language access staff person, which will institute access to city programs and centralize things like translation. I once saw a translation from the city about dog licenses that translated dog licenses into licencias para perros, which means in Spanish, I mean, it sounds like it's perfect translation, right? But it isn't, because in Spanish, licencia is a diploma. And so when you read that, it was like, oh, diplomas for dogs, who wants that? So it's you know, that's an example of the kinds of things that will be remedied with somebody like a language access staff person that will work with, will be in the city manager's office where they have power to make some changes throughout the organization. And then outreach staff has been working very diligently on finding creative ways to reach disenfranchised folks. We've got one thing that is Conversaciones con la Ciudad, which is happening at Sacred Heart Church, which is opportunistic. we found that parents were coming and dropping off their children to catechism and then killing an hour and a half. We're taking advantage of that hour and a half. And we're going to go there every other month and talk to folks and find out what their need. Already there's some good outcomes. We found that folks were needing help with fixing up their mobile homes. What if just a few of those $15,000 subsidies for electric vehicles went to fixing up people's cars so that they can get to their jobs? What if some of the subsidies for energy efficiency went towards people just fixing up their mobile homes? So those are gaps that we have in our system because we aren't thinking about those gaps and we aren't working on identifying them, or weren't. We are hopefully moving forward. So thank you all for being here.
So if anyone has questions, please ask Mary and Junie. We have time for a couple of questions. There's one here, go ahead.
Yeah, one in the back.
Now that we've ascertained that the higher rate you're doing this, so what exactly are you doing? Like, what kind of projects do you have to advance renewable energy or build renewable energy?
I'm not sure I understood your question. If you could, how about if we give you the microphone and ask it? Is that too short? Okay.
People to stand up and vote out loud.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so exactly what kind of projects do you have to build more renewable energy so that you can actually stop relying on fossil fuels?
So one of the things that's going on, I mentioned solar gardens earlier. The Ponderosa Mobile Home Park, which was hugely affected by the 2013 flood, has, what is it now, 7 years since the flood. We just annexed that property into the city, and it will be 100% affordable housing. And its energy is going to come from the solar garden to help reduce those folks' bills, along with highly, highly energy efficient homes that are going to be built. And people will have access to ways in which they can improve their mobile homes. And there is more funding that's needed for helping folks improve their mobile homes, but that's something that will be an ongoing, it's a work in process.
Right over here, Mary.
Oh, right here? Yeah, the woman in black.
Oh, I'm sorry. You mentioned an organization that you'd been looking at lately, sort of looking at systematic.
Oh, the Government Alliance on Racial Equity.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry,
there.
just needed that. Okay,
There, yeah.
thanks.
Uh-huh.
And I saw another hand back here in the back.
Yeah, in terms of decarbonizing people's heating and stoves, things like that, it'll be people who are more well off that'll be able to do that initially, and then what's left on the system becomes less and less, and then as people withdraw their connections to the gas distribution system, the people who will be bearing the brunt of that generally are going to be people with lower incomes who could not afford those initial turnovers so easily. And then the system turns around to its remaining ratepayers and wants to have them carry the burden of the system, where more well-off people who could transition more easily are gone. So do you have any plans for that, addressing that?
That's a really great question, and that's, I think, where our systemic and structural issues rear their challenges, because we need to start thinking about our policies with those people in mind. That's not where we usually start. So it's an issue that needs to be addressed with how we begin to think about our policies. Yeah.
Also, I just wanted to add, we had a study session back in December when I remember you asked that very question about, and I think part of the question was retrofitting and also what are we doing to whether subsidizing, because we're talking about, energy transition, and it will impact people differently. So I think that's something that we're looking into to ensure that everyone is moving along together in an equitable manner.
So we're about 15 minutes away from a break, and I think Junie and Mary will be here. So if you have more that you'd like to ask them about or speak with them about during the break, I think we'll go out into the lobby and have a conversation. So you guys will be around for a little bit, right? Okay, very good. So let's give a thank you.
I just want to end with, the transition's going to happen, definitely going to happen. Let's make an adjustment.
Thank you, Mary and Junie, and I want to take this moment to recognize somebody who I overlooked before. Susan Osborne is here, former mayor of Boulder, very, very instrumental in moving our climate future work along. So thank you, Susan. Sorry I missed you at the very first. And then we're going to talk about microgrids and then take a break and have a conversation after that. So Lili Francklyn from Homer Energy will be talking to us about microgrids for a few minutes.
Hi. So, is this working properly? Yes? So I thought I would, I think everyone kind of knows what microgrids are, so I'm not going to dwell too much on on the technical issues, but pretty much take us outside of Boulder, take us outside of Colorado, and give you some examples of what's happening in other states and other cities. And there's a lot of things we can be really envious of. There's a lot of state incentives for storage. There's state funding for microgrids. I wish Colorado had some of that, but anyway, Sam mentioned that microgrids, he mentioned that there's two things going on here. One is mitigation of climate change, and the other thing is adaptation. Microgrids can actually do both because they provide resilience features, which you'll see, but they're also really great for mitigation because they allow us, through their superior management of energy resources, to get more renewables into our system. You know, for years the utilities have been saying, oh, we can only take such a percentage of renewables, but microgrids are actually increasing the amount of renewable energy that we can add to our portfolio. So next slide, please. So I had to throw this in really quick. The main thing about a microgrid, it's a local distributed energy system that can be isolated or islanded from the main grid. And there's a couple of other characteristics that are kind of optional. One, which is multiple components, like you can have solar, you can have wind, you can have batteries, but you can also just have a microgrid with a diesel engine. A control system is usually something that's required to tell the different elements in the system when to turn on and off, tells the batteries when to switch on, and measures the amount of solar energy that's coming in so that you can manage all these energy resources. And there's often a communication system that can be doing things like pulling in weather data from some national database or predicting, you know, if there's going to be a big storm the following day, things like that. The size range, the 150 megawatts is really the Homer Energy size range. Could we go to the next slide? But you'll see that there's other size issues. Really quick history, Homer Energy, which was recently bought by UL, by the way, which is the commercial arm of the Underwriters Laboratory, so now we are UL, but we're still Homer Energy, is a company that was a spin-off from NREL, and it started out from when NREL was trying to help developing countries green up these remote diesel grids in places like Africa, where there was no electricity at all except what was being provided by one diesel engine. So as they began to do this, they realized that it was pretty complicated to figure out how much solar, how much batteries should go into a given system given the electric load. So they developed this software and they worked on it for over 10 years. And then 10 years ago it was spun off and became Homer Energy. And Homer Energy is now a company that develops and distributes software for pre-feasibility analysis of microgrids. So you can see you can say, what size should my PV system be for this given situation? And is it economically feasible? The software spits out all of the financial, it spits out the capital cost, the levelized cost of energy over a 20-year period. So it's really lowering the risk for people who are trying to design microgrids. Then after it got out of that sort of diesel engine in Africa phase, it started working on islands and communities in Alaska, and then it evolved into situations like university campuses. The military has been one of the biggest adopters of microgrids, and commercial and industrial, and now we're where we should be, which is cities. Next slide, please. Now the cities, I want to do this really quickly. The market is really exploding right now. Navigant estimates it'll be $40 billion by 2023. The United States is the second biggest microgrid market after Asia, but Asia is the biggest. And here are the sizes. Product-led, technology neutral, I'll just describe really briefly. Product-led is when there's a company in Houston, for example, called Enchanted Rock, which does corporate backup systems, like for giant refineries and pharmaceutical companies and stuff. They use natural gas, that's their thing. So that's a product-led microgrid. A technology-neutral microgrid is where they just go shopping and they take elements from all over the place. They might buy a solar system from one vendor, a control system from another vendor, and so those tend to be a little bit more customized and more expensive. Microgrid teams, I stole multiple personality disorder from some guy who runs an engineering firm in California. You really do need a big team of different people. You need the engineers, you need the renewable energy developers, you need the finance people, and you have to get all these people together around this mission. So Homer, we have in our database about 3 million model runs from all over the world, and that is about 70,000 projects. So we keep the data on when people run models, it pings back to our database. So I just want to throw that in. Okay, now we're getting into the meat. I'm just going to show you some cool projects. Next slide, please. This is 2017. So you can see there's really not that many microgrids in the US. And if we're making our slides available later, you'll be able to see the details. This is all the different types of microgrids. So you can't see it as well as you will be able to if you download it later. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so for cities, there is this thing called the value trifecta, which is, and people build microgrids for different reasons, and that's what I'm going to show you in the next few slides. Resilience is keeping the power on in the case of a weather disaster or some kind of other natural disaster. Environmental benefits include CO2 emissions reduction and replacing fossil fuel power generation with renewable power generation. And cost cutting is a really interesting one now, and this is emerging as more and more and more important because just recently, literally in the last few years, the cost of solar PV and batteries has been plummeting, and so now microgrids are competitive with other kinds of energy generation. And so suddenly people are realizing, wow, these are feasible for things like reducing utility demand charges. And a demand charge is separate from the cost of energy. The demand charge is when the utility says you have to pay a fee which is based on the largest amount of, it's different all over the country, so it's really complicated, but the amount of energy you might use on the hottest day of the year, they might base your demand charge on that, or they might base your demand charge on the highest amount of energy use that you have every month over a 15-minute average. And for commercial customers, these demand charges can be huge. They can be tens of thousands of dollars. And it's pretty capricious, and sometimes you don't know what it's going to be, and you just get hit with this giant charge. And it can be 50% of your bill. Okay, next, please. Okay, so here we go. I just could look at this picture forever. Isn't that incredible? This is, okay, next slide, please. The Maui Brewing Company, this all happened because the owner of this company really wanted to be 100% renewable. And if there's a thread through all of these slides, I just want to say it's corporate and organizational leadership. There were a few people who were really, really persistent, really committed to sustainability that made this happen. This guy who owns this company installed solar lighting in his parking lot by himself. And then he became very successful. This is one of the largest brewing companies in Hawaii. This is a $7 million project, but he got huge incentives from the state. Are state legislators still here? So it's that you're looking at a megawatt of PV. They've got Tesla batteries. They have biofuel generators, which is very interesting, and using fuel from agricultural waste in Hawaii. Like, they might even, I think some of it is sugar cane, and they are saving $300,000 a year on utility bills. Hawaii has the highest utility bills in the whole country, 34 cents a kilowatt hour for commercial. Okay, next slide, please. Hang on, how late am I? Oh, shoot. Okay, resilience, microgrids, next slide, please. This is huge. Suddenly, like a few weeks ago, PG&E said we need 20 microgrids by June. California only has about a dozen microgrids in the whole state, so suddenly they're building 20 by June. They're freaking out because you probably all heard about the power cuts last year or this summer. The power cuts are to prevent worse forest fires from happening, but so they're building 20. Santa Barbara School District is turning 18 of their schools into emergency response centers. So every school is going to be a microgrid. And that is very interesting, I think, for us. And they're also building EV charging stations. And going back to what Junie and Mary just said, these EV charging stations are being built in the schools so they can be available to low-income members of the community who can come and charge their cars at night. So I thought that was pretty unique use. And the company that's managing these RFPs is called the Clean Coalition, which some of you might know. They've done some work in Colorado. Ultimately, Santa Barbara wants to have a community microgrid, which is they've already got a couple of little microgrids, and they're gonna kind of network them all together. Next slide, please. This is just one company, one building. Next slide, please. They went off the grid in the middle of town because they wanted to build their own building. They bought a vacant lot. They have been renters for years. They're experienced solar developers. They went to PG&E and said, okay, when can you hook us up? And PG&E said, well, it might take 18 months. It might take 2 years to get your electricity. And they said, what? And then PG&E said, and you'll have to do a $75,000 interconnection study. So they said, no, thank you. We're going to build a microgrid. So they built this system, 60 kilowatts of solar on the roof, flow batteries. The only thing that I thought was one interesting thing is they designed it themselves, but then the city of Santa Cruz was concerned about the noise from the generator at night, so they used Homer Crow to model the whole system and figure out how much time the generator would have to run, which wasn't very much at all. Next slide, please. This one I think is fabulous. This is, if you ever go to, go back to that picture just for a second, just want to, we can linger on it. This is the University of California, San Diego. Okay, next slide. And it's not that different from CU in terms of student population, as you can see. The advantage they have is that the military gave them some land, and so they were able to build from scratch a district cooling system. But this thing is amazing. If you ever go to San Diego, it would be worthwhile, or maybe for Sam, to visit and see and meet with these people and see what they've done. They have got everything. The nub of it is 2 natural gas generators, which in California, universities have to be off fossil fuels by 2025. So most California universities are using natural gas and they are freaking out because they don't know where they're going to get. They're all trying to get a clean fuel. So the market for renewable fuel is going crazy, but I don't know what they're going to do about this. But this natural gas, they use cogeneration. It's all very efficient to cool water that circulates through pipes that go all over the campus and provide all the cooling. Let's see the next slide, though. I want to show you. This guy is a genius. This guy is Byron Washoe, and he's the brains behind all of this. And the buildings they showed us were absolutely incredible. They've done so many innovative things. On the left side of that building there, you can see that's solar thermal. They've got solar PV. They've got these special scooping things on the windows to suck in the sea breezes that come in and cool buildings. So that's what. So I came away with a really much bigger respect for do the buildings first and then build the energy system to fill in whatever you're missing. Okay, next slide, please. We're almost done. I love this one. I just wrote this story for the Microgrid News. This is an $800 million trucking company in the Mid-Atlantic. Next slide, please. Where it's again the leadership of the CEO who just said, I want a sustainable company. I'm going to spend whatever it takes. But, oh shoot, stop that. Okay, that was my timer. That was my timer. I'm almost done. So they have the coolest thing. They built 2 microgrids. They turned 2 of their freight centers into microgrids. The new one is the Palmer one, and it's very unusual because they're using direct DC power. So they're powering their data center and their lights and all their computers and everything. So instead of having plugs in the wall, they have little USB things where they can plug their computers in. They also have an AC bus, but they can charge their equipment directly with DC. So this is a spectacular building. It's got PV, wind, batteries. It has EV charging stations for the employees when they get to work. And a lot of it, another theme I think I've noticed in where these really cool projects are happening is number one, you have really committed corporate leaders. Another theme is you often have interesting partnerships between the academic community and companies. And in this case, the University of Pittsburgh Engineering School, the guy who runs that school is a microgrid fanatic. His name is Gregory Reed, and he is so enthusiastic. So he was the one who convinced them to do all this. So the UPitt students, next slide please, have a permanent lab in the building at the company where the students go once a month and they measure what's going on with the microgrid and take readings and plan for future expansion. Pittsburgh in general is doing a lot with microgrids. This is a separate issue, but next slide please. There's another professor at the University of Pittsburgh who's a climate person, and she got a grant from the Homeland Security to analyze all of the neighborhoods in the city and find out which ones were the most stressed in terms of resilience. So the red neighborhoods are the ones that are facing the greatest risk in the case of a serious flooding event. So she did all these really complicated things. She used geospatial data and all sorts of other kinds of data. There is a story about this in the Microgrid News to identify the high-risk communities, but also to identify the communities that should have the first microgrids in the city for emergencies. So they kind of mapped out, where were the hospitals, where were the cell towers, where were the other resources that first responders or people might need, or where were the high schools, things like that. And then they said, okay, this is where we should invest our first microgrids. Okay, so last slide. So really quick, Cleveland, $100 million microgrid. All these are all other cities building microgrids. Next slide. What can we do in Boulder? So these are just some ideas that I had. And I think this would be fun to talk about more later. Anywhere there's a big demand charge, Cannabis is very interesting, although it's not really worthwhile if somebody else owns the building and they're getting rent from it. But if you own your own building, it's very interesting. There's a lot of cases where other people are using microgrids for cannabis. And yeah, EV charging, commercial facilities, it just struck me this morning when I was in the shower. Hey, maybe we should show some of these examples to our own business community in Boulder.
Yeah.
We should say, this is what people are doing in other cities. Okay, and then our campus, of course, next. And I think this is the end. Most of those stories that I show you are on the Microgrid news in more detail. So I guess later we can do questions.
This great conversation about the upbeat and positive topic of fracking. My name is Elise Jones, and it's my honor to serve as one of your 3 Boulder County Commissioners. And I want to point out my colleague Matt Jones back here serves with me. So this is going to be quick, high level on what's happening with fracking in Boulder County. Obviously, it's closely related to
Is it on?
what am I doing?
Leave it back.
It was working a minute ago.
Where are the engineers?
All right, jumping right in. So Boulder County has long been concerned about oil and gas impacts and fracking. Obviously, there's a close connection with the climate crisis that we've been talking about, since it's caused by fossil fuels largely. Also, the methane associated with leaks from the oil and gas production process, huge greenhouse gas. Also causes ozone. You might have noticed we're out of attainment for ozone in the larger metro areas. We have air quality concerns. A lot of the fracking that operators want to do in Boulder County is on our open space, which your generous tax dollars help purchase. The industry, the facilities are getting bigger. We're seeing well pads with 20, 30, 40, 50 wells on them, and they're getting closer and closer to people because we have combined horizontal fracking, horizontal drilling and fracking, and that's opened up new reserves. A lot of things to care about. So you'll note the left side being Boulder County, right side being Weld County. We don't have very many wells. It's a source of pride that there have been no new wells drilled in Boulder County since during the time that I've been a county commissioner. I'm not taking all the credit, but coincidence? I think not. But Weld County is the epicenter of drilling in Colorado. We know from the air quality monitor that we have at Boulder Reservoir that everything that gets fracked and drilled in Weld County we breathe here in Boulder County. So we need to care about not just drilling in Boulder County, but everywhere in the state. Also, I just want to point out, Boulder County only has control over what happens in unincorporated Boulder County. We can't control what happens inside the city limits of Erie or Longmont. So, Boulder County has what we call a multi-pronged approach. We try to address the problem of oil and gas development from every which direction that we can, everything from doing our own regulations to getting involved in the state rulemakings. We have at least 4 lawsuits underway. We have our own inspection program, you name it, we're doing it. A critical piece has been mentioned about if we don't like fracking, then we need to reduce our dependence on natural gas, right? No brainer. I think Sam and Steve and Casey have all mentioned that. And a key piece of this is how do we replace the natural gas we use to heat buildings and the water in those buildings, because that's approximately 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions. Nationally, one of the ways that the City of Boulder and Boulder County are doing this is through Comfort 365, which is a program in our nationally renowned Energy Smart program that works directly with homeowners to try to encourage, incentivize them to use renewable heating and cooling systems like air source heat pumps. So if you're interested, check out energysmartyes.com. The key thing is to bring down the cost so it's more affordable. Moving along. So we don't have nearly the authority we want, cities and counties, to decide if, when, where, and how oil and gas development happens in our boundaries. Happily, that got a lot better after the passage of Senate Bill 181 last year and that transformative legislative session. Our lawmakers aren't here, but they did an awesome job. So Senate Bill 181 gave local governments more direct control and oversight over oil and gas. It changed the mission of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, or the COGCC. Is Pam Eaton still here? Yes, she is. Round of applause for her. She's serving on that board. She's personally involved in helping with these rulemakings that we're going to talk about, and that's hard work. And Pam's from Boulder, and she deserves our thanks. The other things 181 did was change the mission of the COGCC. Instead of fostering development, now they have to regulate it and put public health, safety, and welfare first before drilling profits, and it directed several statewide rulemakings. We already had in Boulder County the strongest regulations in the state. 181 gave us new authority, so we immediately put on a temporary moratorium and told our staff, go back to the drawing board and use all the 181 authority to make those regulations even stronger. And that process is underway. We're looking at a laundry list of some 25 different new or enhanced protections that we would want to add. Everything from looking at carbon offsets, being responsible for the source of water that you use when you frack. We're going to add noise and odor controls, looking at requiring better financial assurances, you name it. We are midway through that process, which is including extensive stakeholder outreach. We're going to get an update from staff on January 28th at 3 p.m., which is next Tuesday. And you're welcome to listen online or come to the courthouse and hear about that. We won't be taking public testimony at that one, but there'll be subsequent hearings before the Planning Commission and the County Commissioners where we'd love to get your feedback. We need to make these as strong as possible. I will point out our temporary moratorium goes until March 28th. Obviously, if we need to extend that in order to finish writing our regs, we will. Number of constituents have asked us, why don't you just ban fracking? And that is a very hotly debated topic with all of the lawyers looking at whether or not 181 actually gave us the authority to ban. The bill sponsors who were here earlier, when they were lobbying for their passage of the bill, said no. But they've also subsequently said, but if you can make it work, we'd be supportive. So this is already being litigated. Our legal team's looking at it. Meanwhile, it is absolutely imperative that we have a backdrop of strong regulations in place so that if we have to process permits, we are ready to do so, and we're able to protect our environment and residents. So there are two operators, Crestone and 8 North, that have indicated an interest in drilling in eastern Boulder County in the unincorporated portions. They have submitted applications to the COGCC, the state. They have not submitted applications to the local government that it took to us, and you need to get permits at both levels in order to go forward. I just want to show you really quickly where these proposals are. This is 8 North's proposal as proposed 2 drilling and spacing units, one up north and one up down south. Here's the north one. This is for 32 wells. And because Boulder County is a tough place to drill.
Show people where the county line is.
This is county line, so this is Weld County. All right, and Longmont's up here. The proposal here is because they don't want to go through Boulder County's regulations, which they know are tough. They would drill here and go underneath and get the minerals underneath ours. And then the southern one, this is Erie and Lafayette. Again, they would drill from the city of Erie, where we don't have any control, and get Boulder County minerals underneath.
Where's the Boulder County line here? Or is it, oh,
It's over here. And then moving on to Crestone. Crestone applied with the state to do a comprehensive drilling plan, which is a preliminary voluntary step you can if you wanted to plan to drill a whole huge area. So just sorry. The county line is over here, Highway 52 here. And if we just drill in, so to speak, what they're proposing is 140 wells from several well pads, 56 here, 28 here, and alternative locations for other 56 wells. So huge, huge wells. You'll note the green is county purchased open space and the light green are conservation easements. So obviously that would have an impact. We have the hearing on whether or not this, to go forward with this before the COGCC was postponed by passage of Senate Bill 181. That has not been rescheduled, which is good news.
Elise, what's the name of that lake or reservoir?
Panama, up here. So, needless to say, Boulder County has protested these every step of the way. We have litigation against 3 different lawsuits against 8 North and Crestone for various, we could go into the legal rationale, but I won't because this is high level, to try to stop this. All 3 cases are at the Court of Appeals. We expect rulings this fall. We have not won yet at the court, but we will continue to fight that fight. The other big play is the state rulemaking. Steve and Casey mentioned 181 passed and the climate bills passed this past year. All of that legislation directed either the COGCC or the Air Quality Control Commission to write rules to implement that. Should mention that I got put on the Air Quality Control Commission last spring by the governor, so I get to be a part of that. So there have already been a number of COGCC rulemakings. Again, thank you, Pam. And then there's more coming up. We have one on wellbore integrity in February. And then the big enchilada, the one we've all been waiting for from the COGCC, is on the mission change away from fostering development to regulating it, putting public health safety first. They're required to consider cumulative impacts, and they're required to do alternative site analysis anytime they're drilling your people. So that's going to be a big one that you all should participate in. Mike, are you in the room? 350 Colorado is a good place to plug in to make sure that you can show up at the right time to give public comment. And then, not to be outdone, the Air Quality Control Commission is also doing rulemakings. We had our first big one on oil and gas this December, where we added a whole lot of new controls around storage tanks, expanding leak detection and repair requirements, particularly in our homes. We have more to do. Next fall, we'll do the second tranche, which will include continuous methane monitoring, pneumatic controllers, et cetera, so forth. And then in between, we have the first climate rulemaking is happening in May around inventorying, and then the big one will happen in 2021. So a lot going on with state rulemakings. Again, if we care about breathing what Weld County is drilling, we have to play at the state level as well. And I will close by saying the best way to stay in tune as to what's going on, how to plug into both state rulemakings and our local hearings is at our website. This is the Boulder County website oil and gas page. And you can sign up down here, sign up to actually get notices. So that's the best way to stay involved. And with that, I'll answer any questions. The county line. That hasn't happened yet, but the proposals are for it to happen. We have been active, Boulder County's been active in litigating, even when they're trying to drill in from the outside. So the 8 North proposals, which don't involve our regulations, we're litigating both the northern and southern pieces of their proposal. For that reason, I would also note that the place that they're drilling in from Weld County is a Boulder County-owned conservation easement, because we also try to protect farmland right across the border there. So that's why we care so much, and again, also because we breathe what happens in Weld County. Whenever we can get involved, we do.
So can you argue that migration of the air pollution issues for the
You
health?
know, it would seem like we should be able to sue Weld County for polluting our air. I have yet to get a lawyer to tell me how that can happen, but if anybody wants to join forces, because it is ridiculous. And again, I don't have that website up here, but you can go to the Boulder County website. The air quality monitor that we have at Boulder Reservoir that we pay for, that Dr. Detlef Helmich from CU then processes, and if you all haven't seen his presentation on the impacts associated with air quality blowing in from the oil and gas patch, you should see it. You can also go and see the data online in real time, 24/7 as it comes in. It measures everything from the methane to benzene, etc. But we have not been able to litigate that piece of it yet.
And you can't filter this in your house, so if you're an outdoor recreationist or you just, like you're breathing it wherever.
It's a problem. We should care. That's why I said to get involved in the state rulemakings, because that's where we're clamping down on allowed emissions, enforcement of those, and you can impact air quality both from ozone and climate and air toxics across the whole state. So that's why those rulemakings.
And water.
Water's important too.
Where is Weld County with all the, increased oil and gas production, natural gas production for them? What do they feel about it morally?
Look into their souls and how do they... I don't know if you've all met any of the Weld County commissioners. I don't want to speak ill of a fellow elected colleague. They love oil and gas. That's how they fund their county government. They're proud of it. The citizens, on the other hand, are starting to care a whole lot about the drilling, particularly citizens in Greeley and places like that, where they're having benzene spikes near, schools and that kind of thing. So a lot of the citizen groups are getting activated. They don't have critical mass to elect new leadership, but that's really what needs to happen.
So the recent laws that give the counties and cities more power are based primarily, it seems to me, on the local impacts, right? How is this going to harm people? There are recognized ways to calculate how much are those impacts worth. And it seems to me that the counties and the cities would be, that kind of expertise would be useful to them so they could go to court saying, for every cubic foot of natural gas, it costs you $1,000 in local impacts, making people sick, and the roads and the dust and all the rest of that. As it happens, there are a couple guys working here in Boulder that are nationally and internationally recognized experts in calculating that kind of impact. If you want to be put in touch with them, I can do that.
I would love that. We welcome all ideas, solutions, expertise. This is a team effort. It's multi-pronged, and so any good ideas are welcome, for sure. Listen, are you cutting me off?
No, I'm thanking you so very much. I just appreciate it because, once again, and I feel bad that we didn't put you in the picture. Oh, it's stupid of me. But, we just have these amazing elected officials who are now climate champions, and they're super smart, and they're working their tail off, and just what Elise outlined for us is just a monumental amount of work. So I think I would just, it's a stupid question, but I do a lot of work in coal, and yes, Gillette County in Wyoming thought coal was great until it went kerthunk. And so I think the answer is no, but I'll just raise the question, is anybody talking to Weld County about what happens when your industry goes kerthunk and all those jobs go away? It is really ugly what's going on up in Wyoming. We tried to warn them, and instead they put us in jail. So, some people know that story. So, as a state, I think it's critical that we have that conversation. It turns out non-renewable resources don't renew, and that means jobs go away and tax benefits go away, and we should, as a state, be having that conversation.
I totally agree with that. I have debated the Weld County commissioners and have not gotten very far in that. But I think people are sort of in denial about what the future of fossil fuels is, and they think that they can drill and be just fine, and the money's gonna keep pouring in. And hopefully now that we're talking about just transition, that will include the workers in the oil and gas industry, that we can help them transition even if their elected leaders are a little bit slow to catch on.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Elise. I would say it is great to have partners like Boulder County commissioners working really hard on things that we as a city can't do. We can't work outside of our borders. We are concerned about our open space land. We own a lot of open space land outside of the city limits, and so that's a big concern. So, you know, in partnership with the county, the city hopes to mitigate these impacts. It is of great concern to us that we see so many volatile organic chemicals registered at the Boulder Reservoir, because that means that they're coming on into the city, and people who have high chemical sensitivities tell us that they can feel it when the winds are blowing in from Weld County. So thank you again, county commissioners. Okay, so this isn't the right one we're looking for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about energy democracy and about community power. And one of the reasons that Boulder kicked off the municipal electric utility effort had to do with how we can bring energy democracy to our community. So let's see if I get how this works. Let's try that. Or that. There we go. So when we first kicked off the municipalization project, which means the city of Boulder would take ownership of the electric utility, much like we own our water utility, our wastewater utility, and our stormwater utility, we would add the electric utility, much like 29 other communities in Colorado have control of their own electric utility, such as Fort Collins, probably the poster child. They have some of the best reliability in the nation for their electric supply. It's about 8 times better than Boulder's through Xcel Energy. And so that got us thinking, you know, what could we do if we had our community power system in Boulder Light and Power? And what we've long talked about is that the 3 goals for Boulder Electric Utility would be to decarbonize, decentralize, and to democratize our electricity supply, subject to the 3 R's, which are rates, reliability, and renewables. So we have to be responsible, and the 3 R's are how we're responsible as we achieve the 3 Ds. So I showed this before. This is the framework for the Climate Mobilization Action Plan. We keep people at the center with equity and resilience, and we look at how can we maximize the local renewable energy systems, regenerative agriculture, and circular economy. This is California. This is California because of their electric utility not doing enough maintenance on their electricity system. This concerns me greatly, because if we look up into the foothills just to the west of us, there are lots of power lines going to Nederland and going to other destinations in the foothills. Which way does the wind blow? The wind blows from west to east. So when ignitions like this happen in the foothills of Boulder County, we have to be concerned about what it means for the people of Boulder. Of course we care what it means for the people in Nederland and in the foothills, but our responsibility is to think about what it means for Boulder. So how do we stop this from happening in Colorado? In California, Pacific Gas and Electric, now bankrupt, and with the California Public Utilities Commission trying to figure out what to do with this utility that covers 1/3 of California, they have started 1,500 fires in the last 6 years because of poor maintenance of their transmission and distribution systems. The Camp Fire is probably the worst of the fires that they started in 2018. It killed 85 people. It's deadly serious business. Power is serious, because when power gets out of control, your transformer blows up, your lines go down in a windstorm, you create these fires, and these fires kill people. $12 billion in losses just from 2018 alone. What about the people who didn't have insurance? Dead loss. So what can we do in Colorado? I've been thinking about this because it not only impacts the foothills, but it impacts Boulder. How do we know what the state of the transmission system is that Xcel Energy runs into the foothills west of Boulder? We don't. So what I've been talking about with state legislators, nobody's system, and public transparency of these audits, rather than just reporting to Xcel or confidentially to the PUC, shouldn't the people who might be affected by failures of these systems know and be able to prepare? Aggressive operations and maintenance, so focusing on the highest risk areas and making sure that the facilities that they have are in the best shape possible, including vegetation control, right? What is it that causes these problems in windstorms? It's trees blowing down on power lines. So again, the audit would take a look at the vegetation control that's going on. And then public hearings by the PUC and by the utilities, whoever they are, in these potentially threatened communities. And then also firefighter training. What are the best practices in being able to deal with fires that are created this way, and how can you locate the seat of the fire and begin fighting most effectively from that? So looking forward, shifting closer to home now, thinking about our distribution system and not the transmission system. What we want in our community power system is the maximum amount of solar that we can connect to the grid. So are we limited? Yes. Why are we limited? Well, there's a lot of reasons that you might hear. Among them are distribution system constraints. So what distribution in the US, if you take a look, it's really interesting. Distributed solar has about 1,100 megawatts of installed capacity in the United States, and central utility solar is only about 700 megawatts right now in the United States. And to do the distributed generation, we need a modern distribution system. And so as we've gone through and done the inventory of our distribution system so that we know what we have, so that if we go into condemnation court to take possession of it, we would know what we think it's worth, we have found that much of this is old infrastructure. The typical, I can hear a transformer blow up from my house about once every 4 or 5 months. In the morning, get up, work on the computer, boom. What was that? It was a squirrel hitting a transformer that just blew up. And that, to me, isn't the right way to run the railroad. You would want to know when your equipment is getting old, and you'd want to proactively replace it. In addition, those utility constraints are what can keep solar off of the grid. So when you want to put a big solar system on a commercial facility, you might have to do an interconnection study, and if that interconnection study shows that the utility has not got enough capacity, guess who's responsible for adding the capacity? Whoever wants the next solar system. So, you know, I've had lots of conversations with Xcel, very extended, high-level conversations, and at one point, I started making the pitch to Xcel that what we'd like is the ability to have input. If we were going to have a good partnership with Xcel, the way a partnership works is we get to look at their plans for our distribution system. What are you planning to upgrade? How are you taking into account the amount of solar that we might want to have and where it's at? And what plans do you have to make sure that we're resilient when we have floods or fires? Can we please be part of your planning process for our distribution system? The answer I received is up there on the slide, and it was no, and it wasn't a particularly polite no, and I received that answer multiple times. And so there's a new boss of Xcel in Colorado, PSCO, Alice Jackson, and so I broached this with her. You know, the person who said hell no was not Alice Jackson, and so I've begun talking with her about what can we do and how can we improve resilience? How can we make sure that we can build microgrids? Microgrids around, of course, hospitals, of course, critical infrastructure, but in addition, how can we island whole neighborhoods? How can we set up our distribution system so there are switches at the logical places so that if you have internal battery storage, or if you have internal solar, or if you have an internal genset, that can keep that neighborhood powered, how can we do that? How can we help plan for that? How can we say that we want this? There is no method right now. There's no hook. Maybe at the PUC, but what's the PUC? Who elected the PUC commissioner? Raise your hand if you voted on the PUC commissioner. Right. So when we talk about democracy, we talk about if we had control of our electrical infrastructure and you didn't like what was going on, guess what? You could vote the city council members out who weren't doing what you wanted. And that's not the case with the PUC. It's a very indirect approach. And then to intervene. Leslie, is it easy to intervene at the public utilities? So,
Just too much.
we ask for and say that we deserve, as a city, to have public input into the way our distribution system is planned for resilience, for more solar, for microgrids. And I don't think that's an unreasonable request. And I don't think we should have to do it through the PUC. So these partnerships that Excel is forming with cities, the MOUs that comprise these partnerships, do they speak to this? No. No. So how do we get their attention? We keep going with the municipalization effort because they understand that that effort is what brings power to the people. And if they're willing to power share, if the investor-owned utilities in Colorado are willing to power share, awesome. And if they're not, we say, leave us alone.
Hear, hear.
So, the benefits of decentralized power, you have to start with universal access. This is the equity piece, right? We heard about, people may go off the grid. Well, those people almost certainly are going to continue using the grid for backup. Businesses will for sure. Businesses can't do much of their power from stuff on the roof. So the businesses will need the distribution connection. And so the businesses aren't going away. So 70 to 80% of the load for sure is not going to peel off. But universal access is something that we have to have as a principle around anything, whether it's Excel, whether it's us. And then it also allows choice. It allows individuals to choose, do I want my power wall from Tesla, and do I want my solar on the roof, and can I make myself, as an individual homeowner, grid independent to the extent that if the power goes out, I have power, so I'm resilient. Other things that could come from a fairly managed distribution system would be transactive energy. My neighbor has the ability to put 4 homes worth of solar on their home. Can we make an arrangement where I get the energy? I'm a business in town. Can I purchase from even outside of our footprint 100% renewable energy and have it wheeled over the distribution system? Why, yes, that would be a possibility. The function of the utility would be load balancing, would be making sure that there's backup power available procured by the city in case some of these other arrangements went down, because they will, and that's called standby charges. And these are standard, none of this is magic. This is all kind of standard and understood. And all connected users are going to continue to pay for transmission and distribution. So whether you use it or not, there will be a certain amount that you're going to pay to make sure that if your arrangements for transactive energy or backup go down, you can still get power from the grid. And businesses will do that. Businesses, they don't want to go down. So even if they have their own power, they're going to pay for backup. This will happen again. This will happen again. And so the better prepared we are with neighborhood resilience centers, with places for people to go that are islanded and that are backed up, the better we'll do the next time this happens. So that's why energy democracy and community power are important, and that's why Boulder's pushing ahead. Thank you.
Bravo.
So I'm not going to take questions right now. I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards. We have breakout groups coming, and I want to make sure, Leslie, do you want to come?
Can I implore you to take just a couple questions?
Okay, sure, I'll take a couple.
Everybody gets to talk to the mayor, and this is an amazing opportunity.
Patrick.
Yeah, just to make sure this discussion isn't one-sided, there are a lot of problems with Junie. Just as an example of our water utility, The rates for stormwater went up 75% in 2015. They have now gone up 7% more. If you do the math,
Do you have a question?
yes. Do you believe that our poorly working water utility is a good example of our future electric utility?
Absolutely, our water utility is great. So we charged a lot more for stormwater as a result of the 2013 floods. So we took a look at the infrastructure based on the infiltration that happened in the 2013 floods, which is essentially an extended rain event. And so many people had clay pipes that had been around for a long time, and water got into the clay pipes and it came up through their sewers, and that was a bad deal. And so what we did as a council is we said, what can we do? The utilities department said, we can line those clay pipes. We can extend the life of those pipes 40 to 50 years. Here's what it's going to cost. We had public hearings on it. What did people say? I don't want water coming up through my sewer again, and I don't want water coming up through my sewer if we have an even bigger event. So we said, okay, it's going to cost money, so rather than the 100-year replacement plan that we were on, we accelerated to a 20, 25, 30-year replacement plan to line these sewer pipes. The community totally supported that, and we told them up front, this is what it's going to cost. We have some of the best water in the country. Yeah. We have absolutely very near the top of the ratings for municipal water systems. So Patrick, I say yes. I am very convinced that the electric utility will be run just as well as the water, wastewater, and stormwater utility are. That's one question. On to somebody else, Patrick, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Ann?
Okay. Just a synopsis of where the municipalization process is in the legal pipeline. Are we in condemnation proceedings? Any information you can give, please.
Sure. So we spent a long time in the Public Utilities Commission. We went back and forth with them. We have got everything worked out with Excel at this point as far as agreements goes. There's a few things still hanging around about substations that we're still working out with them. But the PUC has essentially said, we're done, you've made your agreements, and we're in condemnation court. So we filed condemnation shortly before the new year, and we are in the process of going in and condemning the poles and the wires, the transformers, and the substations of Excel. And we have made plans to, where necessary, have parallel utility systems, some of which will serve people who are technically in the county, even though they're enclaves in the city, and then others of which will serve the city. And so the details, the engineering details are fundamentally all worked out, and it's a matter of cost. What will condemnation be? What will going concern be? And what will stranded assets cost be? Those three major figures will determine whether this is financially feasible or not. And so that's where we are, Ann, is we are in condemnation, and we will move, and that will tell us about the cost of the assets and any going concern that may or may not be present. And then stranded assets will be determined by FERC, and there's a whole story behind each of those that I won't go into, but at the end of the day, we're kind of in the find the numbers part of the game.
Do you think a ballot item will be ready for this year, or does it next year?
Well, I don't think the city would necessarily refer it this year, but Mr. Murphy's carrying a ballot initiative to force a vote on the issue in 2020, and there are people in this room who are in favor of the municipal utility who would also like to see that happen this year. And so it's a conversation with the community. That's one reason we have this going on, is so that you can all see what's happening, ask questions, and talk with each other about what you think the appropriate path is. But there will be a ballot issue in 2020 or 2021.
Staff is giving a Muni update Thursday at 6 p.m. at the Riverside.
January 30th, 6 o'clock, Riverside, where I am. And the staff will give an update on Junie, which will allow to go into more details on these questions. How about one more question, Sam?
Sure.
Would that be okay?
It's not municipalization, but it's about distribution system and some of the issues you raised. So there is really good opportunity right now at the PUC, distribution system planning docket. And I'm just wondering, is Boulder participating and going to submit some of these ideas about how to have more say on distribution system matters?
So I don't know the details about that, but I will say that we are active in almost every docket at the PUC that touches the resource planning or distribution system planning. We have folks, including attorneys as well as staff members, that go down routinely to the PUC. So I can't answer your question directly, but I can certainly put you in touch with the people who can answer your question. And so, Leslie, I've got us down for breakout groups now. Do you want to?
Let's go for it.
Okay.
I want to thank everybody. There's clipboards going around about that letters to the editor. Hopefully, again, if you care about climate change, this is a way to have your voice heard. And then, you know, sign up on 350's sheet or Clean Energy Action. We'll let you know when some of these other hearings are. We have moved this state through citizen power. We hear, I have an Excel alert, they're written up 2 or 3 times a week for their leadership on climate change. Who led Excel that way?
You did.
We did, right? And so now we need to accelerate them. Here's my graph. So this is, I'm a scientist by training, so. I took half the bids they received in late 2017. They were refreshed in 2018. I arbitrarily threw out half of them. Graphed those and then graphed the number of bids that Excel took. So yes, they're moving in the right direction, but pace matters. And part of what we need to do as citizens now is underscore time and time again the urgency. I don't need, you know, you just saw Sam's slides. And the way all of us can do that is with a letter to the editor. So please, you know, sign up when you can.